Sometimes the smallest act of mercy can save your life in ways you never imagined. When a weathered rancher finds a dying wildcat caught in an illegal trap deep in the wilderness, he faces a choice that will change everything. Silas Vance could have ended the creature's suffering with one merciful bullet. Instead, he wrapped the snarling bobcat in his vest and began a grueling 10-mile walk home on foot. But as darkness fell over the treacherous pass called Wolf's Gullet, 6 starving wolves emerged, circling closer. With his hands cradling the bleeding cat and no way to reach his gun, death seemed certain. Then something impossible happened, what turned a deadly predator into a guardian. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun broke over the Bitterroot Range in waves of amber and gold, painting the Montana foothills in shades that reminded Silas Vance of better days. He stood on the weathered porch of his ranch house, a structure that had seen 50 winters and still stood firm against the wind that swept down from the high country. At 67, Silas wore his years like the mountains wore their scars, visible, earned, and permanent. His hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam rising into the cool air. The coffee was strong and black, the way Sarah used to make it. 10 years she'd been gone, taken by an illness that moved faster than any of them could comprehend, and still he made the coffee her way. Some habits you kept because they were practical. Others you kept because letting them go meant admitting someone was really gone. The ranch stretched out before him in all directions, 300 acres of high grassland and rocky outcroppings that butted up against wilderness so remote that some of the old maps still showed blank spaces. It wasn't much by Montana standards, but it was his, had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. The Vance family had worked this land since 1887, back when the territory was still wild and unforgiving in ways that modern folks couldn't quite grasp. Silas took a slow sip of his coffee and let his gaze drift to the eastern fence line, where the foothills began their gradual climb toward the higher peaks. Somewhere up there, a calf was missing. A young Hereford heifer he'd counted 2 days ago during his weekly check. She'd been with the herd then, healthy and unremarkable. Yesterday morning, she wasn't. He'd found signs, tracks leading into the rougher country, a tuft of red hide caught on barbed wire where she'd pushed through a gap in the fence. Most ranchers would have written off one calf. The math was simple enough. The time and effort it took to track down a single animal in that terrain rarely justified the cost, but Silas had never been most ranchers. He'd spent 30 years as a wildlife officer before age and politics pushed him into retirement. He knew these mountains like he knew the lines on his own palms. More than that, he'd taken an oath a long time ago to protect things that couldn't protect themselves. That oath hadn't come with an expiration date. He drained his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail, then turned back into the house. The interior was spare and clean, everything in its place. The living room held a worn leather sofa, a wood stove, and a single bookshelf filled with field guides and veterinary manuals. On the mantel sat a tarnished silver locket, the clasp broken years ago. He picked it up, as he did most mornings, and opened it carefully. Sarah's face looked back at him from a faded photograph, her smile bright and genuine. Next to her image was a smaller photo of their daughter, Emma, taken when she was maybe 8 or 9. Dark hair in braids, gap-toothed grin, eyes full of wonder. That girl had loved this ranch, loved tracking animals with him through the high meadows, loved helping her mother tend the garden that used to flourish behind the house. The woman Emma had become was a stranger to him now. She'd left for Seattle 12 years ago, right after high school, hungry for a life that Montana couldn't provide. He understood it, even if it hurt. Young people needed to find their own path. What he didn't understand was the silence. Calls that went unreturned, letters that received one-sentence replies. Sarah's death had widened that gap into a chasm. Emma had come back for the funeral, stayed 3 days, and left without saying much of anything that mattered. He closed the locket and set it back on the mantel, then moved to the kitchen to pack supplies. Tracking could take all day if the calf had wandered far. He filled his canteen from the pump, wrapped some jerky and hardtack in wax paper, checked his compass and knife. The revolver came last, a Colt single-action army that his father had carried. Silas didn't like firearms much, preferred to avoid situations where they became necessary, but the high country had its dangers. Bears, mainly, though wolves had been making a comeback in recent years. Outside, he saddled Rusty, a 15-year-old bay gelding with a patient disposition and steady nerves. The horse had been with him almost as long as the silence from Emma. They'd developed an understanding over the years, the kind of partnership that didn't require many words. Rusty stood calm, while Silas checked the cinch and secured his bedroll, only turning his head slightly to watch the process with one knowing eye. "We're heading up into the rough stuff today," Silas told the horse, running a hand along his neck. "Going to need you to keep your wits about you." Rusty snorted softly, a sound Silas had learned to interpret as acknowledgement. He swung into the saddle with a slight grunt, his knees reminded him every morning that he wasn't 30 anymore, and turned the horse toward the eastern fence line. The morning was clear and cool, perfect tracking weather. The ground still held dew, which meant prints would show clearly. Silas rode at an easy pace, letting Rusty pick his way through the sage and bunch grass while he scanned the terrain. The foothills rose gradually at first, gentle swells of land dotted with juniper and ponderosa pine. Further up, the country turned rocky and steep, cut through with ravines and draws that could hide all manner of things. He found the gap in the fence within an hour, just where he'd left it 2 days ago. The wire was old and rusted in places, a repair job he'd been putting off. The calf's tracks were still visible in the soft earth beyond the fence, heading northeast into rougher country. Silas dismounted to study them more carefully. The prints were clean and evenly spaced, suggesting the animal hadn't been running or distressed when it passed through. That was something, at least. He led Rusty through the gap and remounted, following the tracks up into the hills. The land here was ancient, shaped by glaciers and time into a maze of ridges and valleys that could confuse even experienced outdoorsmen. Silas navigated by landmarks he'd known since childhood, a lightning-struck pine, a rock formation that looked like a crouching bear, a spring that ran cold and clear year-round. As the sun climbed higher, the tracks led him deeper into country he rarely visited anymore. The terrain grew steeper, the soil rockier. Ponderosa gave way to Douglas fir and lodgepole pine, their shadows creating pockets of coolness that felt good against the warming day. Somewhere up ahead, a raven called out, its voice harsh and lonely. Silas noticed other signs as he rode. Elk droppings, fresh enough to still be soft. Claw marks on a tree trunk, probably a black bear marking territory. The deeper he went, the more he felt the weight of the wilderness pressing in. This was country that hadn't changed much in 1,000 years. It operated by rules older than any human law, rhythms that had nothing to do with calendars or clocks. Around midday, he stopped to water Rusty at a small creek and eat some jerky. The horse drank deeply, while Silas studied the surrounding landscape. The calf's tracks had become harder to follow on the rocky ground, but he'd found enough sign to confirm she was still heading northeast into a section of foothills cut through with ravines and draws. What troubled him was the other sign he'd started noticing. Torn earth in several places, disturbed vegetation, patterns that didn't match natural animal movement. He'd seen these marks before, years ago when he'd worked as a wildlife officer. They were the calling cards of trappers, and not the legal kind. Illegal trapping had become a problem in recent years. Poachers using cruel, modified traps to catch predators for their pelts. The traps were vicious things, serrated and spring-loaded, designed to hold an animal until the trapper returned. Sometimes that took days. The suffering they caused made Silas's blood run cold. He'd spent years of his career tracking down trappers, confiscating their equipment, and filing charges that rarely stuck. The men who set these traps knew the country well and covered their tracks carefully. But they made mistakes. Everyone did, eventually. Silas remounted and continued following the calf's trail, but now he moved more cautiously, watching for disturbed ground or unusual patterns in the vegetation. Rusty seemed to sense his tension, stepping more carefully, ears forward and alert. The afternoon shadows were lengthening when they entered a narrow ravine flanked by steep rock walls. The calf's tracks were clear in the sandy bottom, along with something else, drag marks and dark stains on the rocks that could only be blood. Silas's jaw tightened. He dismounted and ground-tied Rusty, then moved forward on foot, following the signs. The ravine curved sharply to the left, opening into a small clearing surrounded by jagged outcroppings. What he found there confirmed his worst suspicions. The calf lay on its side near the far wall of the clearing, clearly dead for at least a day. The body had been partially consumed by scavengers, nature's way of recycling everything back into the system. But it was the other sight that made Silas stop cold. 20 feet from the calf, partially hidden in the shadow of a large boulder, was a trap, and caught in that trap, its leg mangled and bloody, was a young bobcat. The creature was small, probably not more than a year old, with tawny fur matted with blood and dirt. The trap had clamped around its left hind leg with brutal efficiency, the serrated teeth biting deep into flesh and bone. The bobcat had clearly been there for some time, fighting against the steel jaws until exhaustion finally claimed it. Now it lay panting in shallow, rapid breaths, its amber eyes glazed with pain and shock. Silas had seen plenty of trapped animals during his years as a wildlife officer. Each one affected him, but he'd learned to compartmentalize the emotion, to focus on what needed doing. The protocol was simple enough. If the animal could be safely released and had a reasonable chance of survival, you released it. If the injuries were too severe, if suffering was inevitable and prolonged, you ended things mercifully. He knelt slowly, keeping his distance, and studied the bobcat's condition. The leg was destroyed, no question about that. The trap's teeth had crushed bone and severed muscle. Even if he got the animal to a veterinarian, and the nearest one was 60 miles away, the leg would likely need amputation. A three-legged bobcat had almost no chance of survival in the wild. Couldn't hunt effectively, couldn't escape predators, couldn't compete for territory. The humane choice was clear. Silas drew his revolver and checked the cylinder. One shot, placed carefully, and the creature's suffering would end. He'd done it before, more times than he cared to count. It never got easier, but it was necessary. Sometimes mercy wore a hard face. He raised the revolver, sighting carefully on the bobcat's head. His finger rested on the trigger, steady despite his age. One squeeze, and it would be over. Then the bobcat's eyes found his. They weren't glazed anymore. They were sharp and clear, and filled with something Silas recognized immediately, the fierce, desperate will to live. The creature didn't look away, didn't close its eyes in resignation. It stared directly at him with an intensity that seemed to cut through all the practical considerations, all the logical arguments for ending its suffering. In that moment, Silas saw Sarah. Not literally, of course. But he saw the same defiant spark she'd carried in her final months, when the doctors had given up hope and suggested hospice care. She'd refused to surrender, fought for every day with a determination that humbled everyone around her. The treatments had failed, the disease had won in the end, but she'd never stopped fighting, never stopped believing that the next day might bring something worth living for. "Damn it," Silas muttered, lowering the revolver. He knew what he should do, knew what every bit of training and experience told him was right, but standing there in that ravine, looking into those amber eyes, he couldn't pull the trigger. Not when the creature was still fighting, not when it still had that spark. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory, something she'd said near the end. "Promise me you won't stop seeing the fight in things, Silas. Promise me you won't become so practical that you forget about miracles." He'd promised, and he'd broken that promise every day since she died, choosing isolation over connection, practicality over hope, but not today. "All right," he said softly to the bobcat. "We'll do this your way." He holstered the revolver and shrugged out of his denim vest, leaving him in just a work shirt against the afternoon heat. Moving slowly, talking in a low, steady voice, he approached the trapped animal. The bobcat's eyes tracked his movement, its body tensing. When Silas got within 6 feet, it gathered what strength it had left and snarled, showing teeth designed for tearing flesh. "I know," Silas said calmly. "I know you're scared. I know you hurt. But I'm trying to help you, and I need you to trust me just a little bit here." The words were probably meaningless to the animal, but the tone seemed to matter. The bobcat's snarl faded to a low growl, its eyes never leaving Silas's face. He knelt beside the trap and examined the mechanism. It was a cruel piece of work, modified from a standard leg-hold trap with the addition of serrated teeth and an extra strong spring. Opening it would require both hands and considerable force, which meant he needed to immobilize the bobcat first. Working quickly but carefully, Silas spread his vest on the ground and positioned himself to wrap the animal. The moment he reached for it, the bobcat erupted into frenzied movement, snarling and snapping despite its weakened state. Teeth caught his forearm, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. Claws raked across his hands as he wrestled the thrashing creature into the vest, wrapping the tough denim around its body to pin the front legs and protect its injured hindquarters. The struggle lasted less than a minute, but felt like an hour. When it was done, Silas had the bobcat secured in a makeshift bundle, its head free but its body immobilized. Blood ran from 6 scratches and bites on his arms and hands, but nothing serious. The bobcat had exhausted itself again, panting heavily inside the vest, eyes still defiant, but body unable to fight anymore. "There now," Silas said, breathing hard himself. "That's the hard part done." He opened the trap with effort, the strong spring resisting his grip. The serrated jaws came apart with a metallic click, releasing their hold on the mangled leg. The bobcat whimpered, the first sound of pure pain it had made as blood flow returned to the damaged tissue. Silas adjusted his grip to better support the injured leg and stood carefully, cradling the wrapped animal against his chest. The creature was surprisingly light, maybe 20 pounds at most, but awkward to carry. He could feel its heart racing against his ribs, feel the shallow rise and fall of its breathing. Now came the real problem. He turned back toward where he'd left Rusty and stopped. The horse was gone. The reins he'd used to ground-tie the animal lay trampled in the dirt, and there were clear hoofprints heading back the way they'd come at a full gallop. Silas understood immediately what had happened. Rusty had caught the scent of blood, the scent of the bobcat, and something else, something that had spooked him badly enough to break his training and bolt. Horses had good instincts about predators, and right now those instincts were screaming at Rusty to get as far away as possible, which meant Silas was standing in a remote ravine 10 miles from his ranch, holding an injured predator on foot. He looked down at the bobcat in his arms, then up at the surrounding ridges. The sun was past its peak now, probably 3 or 4 in the afternoon. He had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left, 5 if he pushed it. 10 miles of rough country to cover, carrying a 20-pound animal that would need constant attention. The smart thing would be to put the bobcat down now and hike out alone. He'd be home by dark, could come back tomorrow for Rusty. But when he looked at those amber eyes again, still watching him, still fighting, he knew he wasn't going to do the smart thing. "Looks like we're walking home together," he told the creature. "Better settle in. It's going to be a long afternoon." He adjusted his grip, settled the bundled bobcat more securely against his chest, and began walking. Behind him, in the shadows of the high rocks, something moved. It was large and silent, staying just out of clear view. Silas caught a glimpse of tawny fur, a flash of a long tail disappearing behind a boulder. The mother. Had to be. She'd been watching, probably from the moment he'd entered the ravine, waiting for an opportunity to reclaim her kit, and now she was following. Silas kept his right hand near his revolver as he walked, though he knew if she decided to attack, he'd have almost no chance. His hands were occupied with the bobcat, Drawing and firing would take precious seconds he wouldn't have. He pushed the thought aside and focused on the path ahead, 1 step at a time, 1 mile at a time. He'd made harder journeys before. At least, he hoped he had. The first mile tested every assumption Silas had about his own endurance. The bobcat, despite being relatively small, felt like it gained 5 pounds with each 100 yards. The awkward position required to support both the animal and its mangled leg put strain on muscles Silas hadn't used in years. His shoulders burned, his forearms cramped, and they'd barely started. The terrain didn't help. The ravine floor was uneven, littered with rocks that turned underfoot and patches of loose shale that required careful stepping. Any fall would be catastrophic for him and for the creature he carried. So he moved slowly, testing each foothold, ignoring the voice in his head that kept calculating how much daylight remained. The bobcat had gone quiet, its initial panic fading into a state somewhere between shock and exhausted acceptance. Its breathing remained shallow but steady. Every few minutes, Silas felt a small tremor run through the animal's body, and he wondered if it was going into deeper shock. He'd seen that before in injured wildlife, the body's last defense mechanism before shutting down entirely. "Stay with me," he murmured, adjusting his grip to better support the wrapped bundle. "We've got a ways to go yet, and I need you to keep fighting." He had no idea if the words mattered, but talking helped him as much as the animal. It gave him something to focus on, besides the pain building in his shoulders and the growing certainty that he'd made a terrible mistake. His canteen hung from his belt, 3/4 full. Water wouldn't be a problem for him, but the bobcat needed fluids too. When he reached a relatively flat section of the ravine floor, he stopped and carefully adjusted his hold to free one hand. He unscrewed the canteen cap and tilted it gently, letting a few drops fall onto the bobcat's nose. The creature flinched at the contact, but then its tongue emerged, lapping weakly at the moisture. Silas gave it a little more, watching carefully to make sure it didn't choke. The bobcat drank maybe a tablespoon before turning its head away, but it was something, a sign that the survival instinct was still engaged. "Good," Silas said, returning the canteen to his belt. "That's real good." As he prepared to resume walking, movement on the ridge above caught his eye. He froze, scanning the rocks. There, a flash of tawny fur, a shape that was there and then gone, too large to be a bobcat, too deliberate to be an elk or deer. The mother was still following, still watching, still waiting. Silas understood her drive. She'd tracked her injured kit to this ravine, probably arrived too late to prevent the trap from closing. She'd been circling, trying to figure out how to free her offspring when he'd shown up. Now she was caught between her protective instincts and her wariness of humans. She wanted her kit back, but she wasn't sure how to get it without exposing herself to danger. That uncertainty was the only thing keeping Silas alive right now. He continued walking, keeping his senses alert for any sign that the mountain lion's calculus had changed. Every shadow seemed to hold threat. Every sound made his pulse quicken. But he forced himself to maintain a steady pace, to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. His mind drifted back through the years as he walked, finding its way to memories he usually kept locked away. He remembered teaching Emma to track when she was young, maybe 9 or 10 years old. They'd spent a whole afternoon following deer prints through the high meadows, and when they finally spotted the small buck bedded down in the trees, her face had lit up with pure wonder. "How did you know he'd be there?" she'd asked in a whisper. "You learn to read the signs," he'd told her. "The land tells you stories if you know how to listen." She'd been so eager then, so hungry to learn everything he could teach her about the wilderness. When had that changed? He'd replayed it in his mind 1,000 times, trying to pinpoint the moment when his daughter had started pulling away. Was it gradual? Had there been a specific event? Or had he simply failed to notice until the gap was already too wide to bridge? Sarah would have known. Sarah had always understood Emma in ways that eluded him. She'd been the bridge between his gruff practicality and their daughter's need for emotional connection. When Sarah died, that bridge collapsed, and Silas had never figured out how to rebuild it on his own. The bobcat stirred in his arms, pulling him back to the present. Its eyes were still open, still alert, tracking the movement of the shadows around them. Tough little creature, Silas thought, refusing to give up even when any sane animal would have surrendered to the inevitable. He realized with some surprise that he'd covered almost 2 miles. His muscles screamed in protest, but he'd found a rhythm 300 steps, then a brief pause to adjust his grip and check his surroundings, then 300 more steps. It wasn't fast, but it was sustainable. The ravine began to open up, the walls growing lower and less steep. Ahead, the terrain transitioned into a series of rolling hills covered in sage and juniper, more exposed country, which meant fewer places for a mountain lion to hide, but also fewer places for him to take cover if she decided to attack. As if summoned by his thoughts, he caught another glimpse of the big cat. This time she was closer, maybe 50 yards away, moving parallel to his path. She was magnificent, easily 7 feet from nose to tail, muscled and powerful, her coat a rich, tawny color that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Silas saw intelligence there, calculation, and something else he couldn't quite name. She was studying him, trying to figure out what kind of threat he posed, what his intentions were with her kit. "I'm trying to save it," Silas said aloud, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "I know you can't trust that. I know every instinct you have is telling you to take it back. But I'm your best chance right now. I'm its best chance." The mountain lion held his gaze for a moment longer, then melted back into the sage, disappearing as if she'd never been there. Silas took a shaky breath and kept walking. His shirt was soaked with sweat, despite the cooling air. The sun was lower now, maybe 2 hours from setting. He'd covered 2 miles, maybe a bit more. 8 miles to go, and the hardest part was still ahead. The path out of the ravine led through a narrow gap between 2 ridges, a shortcut he'd used before. The alternative was a longer route that added 3 miles to the journey. Under normal circumstances, he'd take the longer path, safer, more predictable. But with the bobcat's condition deteriorating and daylight burning away, he couldn't afford the extra time. He angled toward the gap, commit to the shortcut, and tried not to think about what would happen if his strength gave out before he reached home. By the time Silas reached the 3-mile mark, his arms had gone from burning to numb. The vest holding the bobcat had grown heavy with blood and sweat, the denim dark and wet. He'd had to stop twice to readjust his grip, each time worried that the movement would trigger another fight from the injured animal. But the bobcat remained still, its breathing more labored now, eyes half closed. That worried him more than the earlier struggles. Fight meant survival instinct. Stillness might mean the creature was giving up. He paused at a flat section of trail and carefully lowered himself to one knee, supporting the bundled animal on his thigh. His fingers were shaking with fatigue as he reached for the red bandana in his back pocket. Sarah had given it to him on their first anniversary, a simple gift that had somehow become one of his most treasured possessions. He'd carried it every day since, using it for everything from wiping sweat to filtering water. Now he folded it lengthwise and carefully slipped it under the bobcat's body, creating a makeshift sling that he tied around his neck. The configuration distributed the weight more evenly across his shoulders and freed up his hands slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. The bobcat's eyes opened fully as he adjusted the sling, and for a moment Silas thought it might panic again. Instead, it just watched him, with what seemed like weary resignation. The mangled leg hung at an unnatural angle, the blood flow having mostly stopped, but the tissue around the break already beginning to swell. Silas knew enough veterinary medicine to recognize that even if they made it back to the ranch, the leg was beyond saving. The best-case scenario was amputation and a long, uncertain recovery. And that was if the bobcat survived the journey, if infection didn't set in, if shock didn't claim it first. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded like his father, said he was wasting his time. Wasting energy he'd need to get himself home safely. The animal was going to die anyway, and he was risking his own life for nothing. But another voice, quieter and more recent, countered that practicality. It was Sarah's voice, and it said what it had always said, that some things were worth doing even when the odds were against you, that trying mattered, even when failing seemed inevitable, that giving up too soon meant you'd never know what might have been possible. "All right," he said to the bobcat, standing with a grunt of effort. "Let's see how far we can get." The terrain ahead was gentler, a series of low hills that rolled toward the distant outline of his ranch. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Beautiful country, even in his exhausted state, the kind of country that made you understand why the old-timers had fought so hard to settle it. As he walked, he became aware of the mother mountain lion again. She'd grown bolder, showing herself more frequently. Twice he saw her on ridges no more than 30 yards away, her golden eyes tracking his every move. She was pacing him now, matching his speed, staying close enough to act if an opportunity presented itself. Silas found himself talking to her as he walked, his voice low and steady. "I had a daughter once," he said. "Still do, I suppose, though I haven't seen her in years. Emma, named her after my grandmother. She was like you, in a way. Fierce, protective instinct, wouldn't back down from anything. Sarah used to say, Emma got that from me, but I think she got it from her mother." The mountain lion didn't respond, of course, but she didn't attack either, just kept her distance, watching. "Emma and I used to hike these hills together," Silas continued. "I taught her to track, to read the land, to respect the animals we shared it with. Thought I was giving her something valuable, thought she'd want to stay, carry on with the ranch. But people need different things. I understand that now. Took me too long to understand it, though. By the time I figured out I should have been listening instead of teaching, she was already gone." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, surprising him. He hadn't talked about Emma in years, not even to himself. But exhaustion and pain had a way of breaking down the walls you built around difficult subjects. "I don't blame her for leaving," he said. "This life isn't for everyone, but I wish I'd tried harder to understand what she needed. Wish I'd been less concerned with being right and more concerned with being present." The mountain lion paused on a ridge ahead, silhouetted against the setting sun. For a moment she looked more like a statue than a living creature, perfectly still, utterly focused. Then she turned and disappeared into the sage once more. The bobcat in Silas's arm stirred, its body tensing briefly before relaxing again. Its breathing had changed, becoming more shallow. He gave it a few more drops of water from his canteen, and it licked weakly at the moisture before turning its head away. "You're thinking about giving up, aren't you?" Silas said softly. "I can see it. I've seen it before in injured animals. The body just decides it's had enough, starts shutting down, but you can't do that yet. We're not done fighting." He realized he was talking to himself as much as to the animal. His own body was sending him similar signals. His legs felt like they were made of lead, his shoulders burned despite the sling. Every step required conscious effort, conscious decision to keep moving forward. The temptation to stop, to rest, was overwhelming. He could find a defensible position, wait out the night, tackle the remaining distance in the morning when he was fresh, but morning might be too late for the bobcat. And spending a night in the open with an injured predator and its mother circling would bring its own dangers. So he kept walking, one step, then another, not thinking about the miles still ahead, just focusing on the next footfall, the next breath, the next moment. The sun touched the horizon, and the temperature began to drop. Silas could feel the bobcat shivering in its wrappings, whether from shock or cold he couldn't tell. He adjusted the vest to cover more of its body, trying to preserve what warmth remained. Ahead, the trail descended into a wide valley, and beyond that valley, visible in the fading light, was a dark gap between two hills, Wolf's Gullet. The narrow pass had earned its name decades ago when a pack of wolves had ambushed a group of travelers there. It was the fastest route to his ranch, cutting 2 miles off the journey. It was also the most dangerous section of the entire trek. Silas stood at the edge of the valley, looking at the distant pass, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The alternative was to skirt around the valley, adding those 2 miles and at least another hour to his journey. In his current condition, he wasn't sure he had another hour in him. Behind him, somewhere in the gathering shadows, the mother mountain lion waited. Ahead, the pass beckoned, dark and threatening. He took a deep breath and started down into the valley. The valley floor was softer than the rocky hills, covered in tall grass that whispered in the evening breeze. Under different circumstances, Silas might have appreciated the relative ease of the terrain, but as the light faded and shadows deepened, every whisper of grass became a potential threat, every dark shape a predator waiting to spring. The bobcat had gone completely still. Silas could feel its heartbeat against his chest, rapid and fluttering like a bird's. Too fast. He'd seen that before in animals close to the end. The heart racing, trying to compensate for failing systems, burning through the last reserves of strength. "Not yet," he said firmly. "You don't get to quit on me yet." He increased his pace slightly, ignoring the protests from his legs and back. The pass was maybe a mile away now, a dark notch between the hills that seemed to swallow what remained of the daylight. Behind him, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, a low, keening call that echoed across the valley. The mother mountain lion. She was calling to her kit, a sound full of worry and warning. The bobcat in Silas's arms responded with a weak, mewling cry, barely audible but unmistakable. That's when Silas understood. The mother knew what he'd figured out miles ago. Her kit was dying. This wasn't about reclaiming a temporarily lost offspring anymore. This was about a mother trying to be with her young in its final moments. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He thought about Sarah's last days, how she'd asked him to stay close, to hold her hand, how the doctors had suggested he should rest, should take breaks, should preserve his own strength. He'd ignored all of it, stayed by her bedside for 3 days straight, holding her hand, talking to her, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. Emma had been there too at first. But watching her mother fade had been too much. She'd spent more time in the hospital cafeteria or outside than in the room. Silas had judged her for that at the time, seen it as weakness or selfishness. Only later did he understand that people grieve differently, that not everyone could face death head-on. But he'd never told Emma that, never said he understood, just added it to the growing list of things left unsaid between them. The mountain lion called again, closer now. Silas could see her shape moving through the grass, off to his right, a tawny shadow in the deepening twilight. She was maybe 40 yards away, close enough that he could hear the soft pad of her paws on the earth. Part of him wanted to stop, to set the bobcat down, to let the mother approach and take her kit. It would be the merciful thing. The creature was going to die anyway, and at least this way, it could die with family, with someone who truly loved it. But he'd made a promise to the bobcat when he'd decided not to shoot it back in the ravine. He'd promised to fight, and Silas Vance kept his promises, even when they seemed foolish. The entrance to Wolf's Gullet loomed ahead, a narrow gap between steep rock walls. The last light of day barely penetrated the pass, leaving it shrouded in shadow. Silas paused at the entrance, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. This was where logic ended and faith began. Faith that he could make it through. Faith that the bobcat would survive long enough. Faith that the choice he'd made hours ago wasn't just the stubborn pride of an old man who couldn't admit when he was wrong. He entered the pass. The temperature dropped immediately. The rock walls on either side rose 30 feet high, trapping the cold air and blocking what little remained of the sunset. Silas's boots scraped against stone as he navigated the narrow path, each sound seeming to echo endlessly. The bobcat's breathing had become so shallow he could barely feel it. He pressed his hand gently against its ribcage, searching for the heartbeat. Still there, still fighting. He was halfway through the pass when he heard the first growl. It came from ahead, low, and menacing. Silas froze, his eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. For a long moment, he saw nothing. Then movement, a shape detaching itself from the shadows, then another, then four more. Wolves. They emerged from both sides of the pass, 6 of them, lean and hungry-looking. Their eyes caught what little light remained, reflecting it back as pinpricks of green gold. The pack spread out, cutting off both forward progress and retreat. Their leader, a large male with grey-black fur and battle scars across his muzzle, moved to the center of the path. Silas's mind raced through his options. His revolver was still in its holster, but drawing it would require releasing the bobcat. Even if he could manage that, 6 wolves were more than he could handle. He might drop 1, maybe 2, but the others would be on him before he could reload. Running wasn't an option. His exhausted legs couldn't outpace fresh wolves, and the narrow confines of the pass left no room to maneuver, which left standing his ground and hoping the wolves were more interested in easier prey. "Easy now," Silas said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "We're just passing through. No need for trouble." The lead wolf's lips pulled back, revealing impressive teeth. The message was clear. This was their territory, and they didn't welcome trespassers. The other wolves began to circle, their movements coordinated and practiced. This wasn't a random encounter. The pack hunted these rocks regularly, probably using the pass as a natural ambush point. They knew exactly what they were doing. Silas felt the bobcat stir weakly in his arms. The kit mewled again, that same small cry it had made when its mother called. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, announcing the presence of injured prey. The wolves' ears perked up. Their circling tightened. The lead male took a step forward, then another. Silas could smell the animal now, that distinctive wild scent of fur and meat and hunger. The wolf was calculating, trying to determine if the old man represented a real threat or just a convenient meal. "I know you're hungry," Silas said quietly. "I know how it is this time of year, before the elk herds come down from the high country, but this isn't the fight you want." The wolf took another step forward. Silas's hand moved slowly toward his revolver. It was a futile gesture, but he wouldn't go down without trying. His fingers had just touched the grip when everything changed. A roar split the air, a sound of such pure fury that it seemed to shake the very rocks. The wolves spun toward the entrance of the pass, ears flat against their heads, hackles raised. The mother mountain lion stood there, backlit by the last rays of sunset. She looked enormous, her body rigid with rage, her tail lashing. Another roar erupted from her throat, and this time Silas understood it wasn't directed at him. She was defending them, defending the man who carried her dying kit. The mountain lion launched herself into the pass with terrifying speed, a blur of tawny muscle and lethal intent. The lead wolf barely had time to react before she was on him, claws extended, teeth bared. They collided with an impact that echoed off the rock walls, a tangle of fur and violence. The other wolves scattered, their coordinated attack dissolving into chaos. 2 of them turned to help their leader, while the others retreated toward the far end of the pass, yelping in confusion and fear. The mountain lion was larger than any of them, heavier, and driven by something more powerful than hunger. She was fighting for her offspring. Silas pressed himself against the rock wall, cradling the bobcat as close as possible, trying to make himself small and invisible. The battle raged no more than 20 feet away, a brutal display of nature's raw power. The mountain lion's roars mixed with the wolves' snarls, punctuated by the sound of teeth on flesh and claws on stone. The lead wolf was the first to fall. The mountain lion's jaws found his throat and clamped down with crushing force. He thrashed briefly, then went still. She released him and spun to face the 2 wolves circling her flanks, her mouth dark with blood. These 2 were smarter, more cautious. They'd seen what happened to their leader. They separated, one moving left, one right, trying to flank her. But the pass was too narrow for that strategy to work effectively. The mountain lion lunged at the one on the left, and while he dodged her initial strike, his companion couldn't capitalize on the opening. There simply wasn't room. The wolf on the left made a critical mistake. He tried to dart past the mountain lion to reach Silas and the easier prey. She caught him mid-stride, her paw raking across his hindquarters with enough force to send him tumbling. He scrambled to his feet, limping badly, and retreated to join the three wolves at the far end of the pass. The remaining attacker, seeing the odds had turned against him, backed away slowly, teeth still bared, but no longer pressing the fight. The mountain lion didn't pursue. She positioned herself between Silas and the wolves, her body tense, ready to spring if they tried again. For a long moment, the pass was filled with nothing but the sound of heavy breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the rocks. The wolves at the far end huddled together, whining softly. Their leader was dead. Another was injured. Slowly, one by one, they slipped away into the darkness, abandoning the pass to the mountain lion. When the last wolf had disappeared, the mountain lion turned to face Silas. He could see her more clearly now, even in the dim light. Her fur was matted with blood, some of it hers. She had a gash across her shoulder and another along her flank, both bleeding freely. The fight had cost her, but she'd won. Her eyes found his, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Silas saw something in those golden depths that transcended the usual barrier between human and animal. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. She knew he was trying to save her kit. She'd chosen to trust that, chosen to defend him against her own kind. The bobcat in Silas's arms stirred, making that weak, mewling sound again. The mother's ears perked up. She took a step forward, then stopped, her body language uncertain. Every instinct had to be screaming at her to take her kit, to claim what was hers. But she held back, watching, waiting. "I'm going to keep going," Silas said quietly. "I'm going to try to save it. I know you probably don't understand that. I know you probably think I should just let you have it back. But I made a promise." The mountain lion tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then, to Silas's amazement, she moved to the side of the pass and sat down, not blocking his path, not threatening, just watching. An invitation, or perhaps a trust. Silas took a cautious step forward. The mountain lion didn't move. He took another step, then another, his heart hammering in his chest. He passed within 10 feet of her, close enough to see the intelligence in her eyes, close enough to smell the blood on her fur. She let him pass. As he moved beyond her position, Silas heard the soft pad of paws on stone. He glanced back. The mountain lion was following again, maintaining a distance of maybe 20 feet, not hunting now, escorting. The realization left him momentarily speechless. In all his years working with wildlife, in all the books he'd read and experts he'd consulted with, he'd never heard of anything like this. Mountain lions were solitary, territorial, deeply suspicious of humans. Yet here was one actively protecting him, defending him against other predators, trusting him with her dying offspring. The rest of the pass seemed to go by in a blur. Silas's exhaustion had reached a point beyond pain, beyond conscious thought. He simply moved, one foot in front of the other, the bobcat cradled against his chest, the mountain lion following in the shadows. When they emerged from the far end of Wolf's Gullet, full darkness had fallen. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, countless points of light in a clear sky. The temperature had dropped considerably, and Silas could see his breath misting in the air. The terrain ahead was more familiar now. He could make out the silhouette of Copper Ridge to his left, which meant the ranch was maybe 3 miles away. Under normal circumstances, an easy walk. In his current state, it might as well have been 30. The bobcat's breathing had become almost imperceptible. Silas pressed his ear close to its chest and heard the faint, irregular beating of its heart, still alive, but barely. Every minute counted now. He forced his legs to move faster, ignoring the screaming protests from every muscle. The mountain lion kept pace, sometimes visible in the starlight, sometimes just a presence felt rather than seen. She'd stopped calling to her kit, perhaps understanding that silence was better now. They crossed a dry stream bed, then climbed a gentle rise. At the top, Silas could see the distant lights of his ranch house. He'd left the porch light on when he departed that morning, a habit from the years when Sarah and Emma would worry if he stayed out too late. The sight of that light, small and warm in the vast darkness, nearly broke him. He'd been gone more than 12 hours. The journey that should have taken him 4 hours on horseback had stretched into an ordeal that had tested every limit he possessed. But he was almost home. "We're going to make it," he told the bobcat, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Just hold on a little longer." The ranch was 2 miles away when Silas's legs finally gave out. He went down hard, his knees buckling without warning. He managed to twist his body at the last second, taking the impact on his shoulder rather than crushing the bobcat. Pain shot through his arm and ribs, but he held onto the bundled animal, protecting it even as he fell. For a long moment Silas lay there, staring up at the stars, trying to convince his body to move. Nothing responded. His muscles had simply shut down, pushed past the point where will alone could drive them. The bobcat lay against his chest, its breathing so shallow he could barely detect it. "Get up," he said aloud. "Get up, you stubborn old fool." His body ignored him. The mountain lion appeared at the edge of his vision, her massive form moving closer. She approached cautiously, as if uncertain what to make of his collapse. When she was close enough that Silas could have touched her if he'd had the strength to reach out, she stopped and lowered her head, sniffing at the bundle containing her kit. A low, mournful sound emerged from her throat. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was something deeper, more heartbreaking. The sound of a mother facing the inevitable. The bobcat stirred one final time. Its eyes opened, found its mother's face, and a tiny purring sound emerged from its throat. The mother touched her nose to her kit's face, the most gentle gesture Silas had ever seen from a wild predator. Then the bobcat's eyes closed, and its breathing stopped. Silas felt the small body go still against his chest. After everything, after the miles and the pain and the impossible journey, they'd come up short. The kit had died within sight of help, within reach of safety. He closed his eyes, fighting back emotions he couldn't name. It was just an animal, the practical voice in his head said. Just one creature in a wilderness full of life and death. Its passing didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered to him. It mattered because he'd promised to try. It mattered because for the first time in 10 years he'd chosen hope over practicality, chosen to fight against long odds instead of accepting the inevitable. It mattered because it reminded him of every other time he'd come up short, every promise he'd failed to keep, every person he'd lost despite his best efforts. The mountain lion's mournful cry split the night again. She circled the fallen man and her dead kit, her grief palpable and raw. Then she did something that stopped Silas's heart. She grabbed the vest containing her kit in her powerful jaws and lifted it gently from Silas's chest. He felt the weight leave him, felt the sudden cold where the bobcat's body had been pressed against him. The mountain lion turned and began walking toward the tree line, carrying her offspring. "Wait," Silas tried to say, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. She was 20 feet away when she stopped, set the bundle down, looked back at him with those golden eyes, and then she began to dig. Her powerful claws tore at the earth, throwing dirt in great sprays. She dug with focused intensity, creating a hole in the soft soil beneath a large ponderosa pine. When the hole was deep enough, she gently placed the vest and its precious cargo inside, then began covering it with earth. Silas watched, transfixed. He'd seen animals grieve before, but never like this, never with such deliberate ritual. The mountain lion sat beside it, her head lowered, and released another long, mournful cry. That's when Silas's phone rang. The sound was so unexpected, so utterly out of place in the wilderness, that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. But his pocket was definitely vibrating, and the tinny ringtone was unmistakably real. He'd forgotten he even had the phone with him. Reception out here was almost non-existent, and he rarely turned it on. With tremendous effort, he managed to work his hand into his pocket and extract the device. The screen was cracked, probably from the fall, but functional. A number he didn't recognize showed on the display. He almost didn't answer. What could possibly matter right now? But some ingrained habit, some automatic response to a ringing phone, made him press the accept button. "Hello?" His voice was rough, barely recognizable. Silence on the other end. Then, tentative and familiar, "Dad?" The world seemed to stop. Emma, after 3 years of silence, his daughter was calling him. "Emma!" He couldn't keep the shock out of his voice. I'm sorry to call out of the blue. I know it's late. She paused, and he could hear her breathing, shaky and uncertain. "I just found some of Mom's old letters she wrote to me before she died but never sent. She told me to open them when I was ready, and I finally—" Her voice broke. Silas could hear her crying, and something in his chest cracked open. "She wrote about regrets," Emma continued. "About things she wished she'd said. About how short life is and how we waste so much time on pride and stubbornness. She wrote about you, Dad. About how much you love me even though you never know how to say it." Silas tried to speak but couldn't. The events of the day, the exhaustion, the grief over the bobcat, and now this, it was too much. "I know I haven't been fair to you," Emma said. "I blamed you for not fixing things, for not reaching out, but I never reached out either. I was angry about Mom dying, angry at the world, and I took it out on you. I'm sorry." "Emma," Silas managed, "I'm the one who should apologize. I should have tried harder, should have told you that I understood, that I didn't blame you for leaving. That I was proud of you for building your own life." "Where are you?" Emma asked suddenly. "You sound strange. Are you okay?" Silas looked around at the darkness, at the mountain lion sitting vigil by her kit's grave, at his own exhausted body sprawled on the cold earth. How could he possibly explain this? "I'm about 2 miles from the ranch," he said. "I had a rough day, got stranded out in the foothills and had to walk back." "Are you hurt?" "Just tired, real tired." "I'm in Missoula," Emma said. "I drove up from Seattle yesterday. I was going to surprise you tomorrow, but then I got scared. Thought maybe you wouldn't want to see me. So I've been sitting in a hotel room trying to work up the courage to drive the rest of the way." "You're in Montana." "I want to come home, Dad. Even if it's just for a visit, even if we can't fix everything, I want to try. Mom's letters made me realize I've been wasting time we don't get back." "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's everything." They talked for a few more minutes, making plans. Emma would drive out in the morning. They'd have breakfast together, start rebuilding what had been broken. When the call ended, Silas held the phone against his chest and let the tears come. Above him, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns. Beside the fresh grave, the mountain lion remained motionless, keeping watch over her lost kit. And somewhere in the distance, Rusty whinnied, having found his way home to the ranch. Silas took a deep breath and forced himself to move. His body protested every inch, but he managed to roll onto his side, then push himself up to his hands and knees. The ranch lights beckoned, closer now than they'd seemed before. The mountain lion's head turned toward him. Their eyes met one final time. Silas got to his feet through sheer determination, swaying slightly as the world tilted around him. The mountain lion watched him, her expression unreadable in the starlight. He wanted to say something to her, to acknowledge what she'd done, but words seemed inadequate, so he simply nodded, a gesture of respect from one grieving soul to another. The mountain lion stood, stretched, and began walking toward him. Silas's hand instinctively moved toward his revolver, but he stopped himself. If she wanted to attack, she'd had plenty of opportunities. This was something else. She circled him once, her shoulder brushing against his leg as she passed. The contact was brief but deliberate. Then she moved past him, heading toward the ranch, and paused, looking back as if waiting. "You want to come with me?" Silas asked, his voice hoarse. The mountain lion didn't respond, but she didn't need to. Her intention was clear. She'd escorted him this far, saved his life, buried her kit. Now she was going to see this journey through to its end. They walked together through the darkness. An old rancher and a wild predator, united by grief and something deeper than logic could explain. Silas's pace was slow, his legs barely functional, but he kept moving. The ranch lights grew closer, revealing details: his house, the barn, the corrals, and standing in the yard, still saddled, was Rusty. The horse raised his head when he spotted Silas approaching, ears forward, and whinnied nervously. The sound was part greeting, part warning. Rusty could see the mountain lion, could smell her, and every instinct told him to run. But the horse held his ground, perhaps sensing that something extraordinary was happening. "Easy, boy," Silas called out. "I know how this looks. Trust me, I'm as surprised as you are." The mountain lion slowed as they approached the fence line. She was clearly nervous around the structures, the smell of humans and livestock. Her natural wariness was reasserting itself now that the immediate crisis had passed. Silas opened the gate and stepped through, then turned back to her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." The mountain lion sat down just outside the fence line, her tail curled around her paws. She would come no closer. This was the boundary between their worlds, and both of them understood it. Silas made his way to the house, each step an act of will. He unsaddled Rusty with trembling hands, talking quietly to the horse, explaining what had happened in a way that made no sense, but helped him process it anyway. When Rusty was settled in the corral with hay and water, Silas stumbled into the house. The clock on the wall showed 9:47 p.m. He'd been gone for 14 hours. It felt like days. His reflection in the bathroom mirror shocked him. His face was gaunt and pale, covered in sweat and dirt. His clothes were torn and blood-stained. Deep scratches covered his arms, and bruises were already forming across his shoulder and ribs. He looked like he'd been in a war. Maybe he had been. He cleaned the wounds mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The bobcat's death weighed on him, a stone in his chest that wouldn't shift. He'd failed. Despite everything, despite the journey and the pain and the impossible help from the mother, he'd failed to save the creature. But Emma was coming home. After 3 years of silence, of missed opportunities and unspoken words, his daughter was coming home. He couldn't reconcile the two truths: one life ending, another relationship beginning to heal. Loss and hope tangled together in ways that defied understanding. After cleaning up and changing clothes, Silas found himself drawn back outside. The mountain lion was still there, sitting in the same spot beyond the fence, watching the house, watching him. He grabbed a blanket from the porch and walked back to the fence line. The cold had settled in deep now, his breath creating clouds in the night air. He spread the blanket on the ground and sat down, his back against a fence post. "You should go," he told the mountain lion. "Go back to your territory. There's nothing for you here." She didn't move. They sat in silence, two beings who'd shared something profound, neither willing to break the connection just yet. Silas felt his eyes growing heavy. Exhaustion was pulling him under, but he fought it. He wanted to stay awake, to keep watch with her. His thoughts drifted to Sarah, to the promises he'd made at her bedside. He'd promised to take care of Emma, to keep the ranch going, to not let grief consume him. He'd kept some of those promises and broken others. The ranch still stood, but his relationship with Emma had fallen apart, and grief had consumed him, just in slow, subtle ways he hadn't recognized until it was almost too late. The bobcat's amber eyes haunted him. That defiant spark, that refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the logical choice. It had reminded him of Sarah, yes, but also of himself at a younger age. Before loss had taught him to protect himself by not hoping too hard, not fighting too long, not letting himself care too much about outcomes he couldn't control. When had he become so careful? When had survival become more important than living? The mountain lion shifted position, drawing his attention. She was looking at something in the darkness beyond the ranch. Silas followed her gaze and saw movement shapes emerging from the tree line. His hand went to his revolver, but relaxed when he recognized what he was seeing. Deer, a small herd, maybe 6 or 7, moving cautiously toward the ranch's water trough. They'd spotted the mountain lion and were weighing the risk. The predator's body tensed. Every line of her form spoke of coiled power, ready to spring. These were prey animals, a meal she desperately needed after the fight with the wolves and the long journey. One leap, and she could probably take the trailing doe before the herd scattered. But she didn't move. Silas watched, fascinated, as the mountain lion remained still while the deer approached the water. They drank nervously, constantly alert, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. The big cat could have attacked at any moment. Instead, she sat beside Silas and watched them drink their fill. When the deer finally departed, melting back into the darkness, Silas looked at the mountain lion with new understanding. "You're not hunting tonight," he said quietly, still keeping watch. She turned her head toward him, and in the starlight their eyes met. Silas felt something pass between them, a recognition that transcended species. They'd both lost something tonight. They'd both carried their burden as far as they could. They'd both learned that sometimes trying is enough, even when succeeding proves impossible. The temperature continued to drop. Silas pulled the blanket tighter around himself, but remained outside, unwilling to leave his vigil. His body ached in 1,000 places, but the pain felt distant, muted. Exhaustion had pushed him into a strange state beyond normal sensation. He thought about Emma, about seeing her again after so long. What would he say? How did you bridge 3 years of silence? Sarah's letters had apparently given Emma the courage to try, but what would give him the courage to meet her halfway? The bobcat had tried until its last breath. The mountain lion had risked everything to defend a stranger who held her dying kit. Maybe courage wasn't about knowing you'd succeed. Maybe it was about trying anyway, about showing up and doing the work even when the outcome was uncertain. He'd been so afraid of failing Emma again, of saying the wrong thing or pushing her away, that he'd said nothing at all. He'd chosen silence because it felt safer than risk. But safety had given him 3 years of loneliness and regret. The mountain lion stood suddenly, her ears swiveling toward a sound Silas couldn't hear. She took a few steps away from the fence, then stopped and looked back at him one final time. Her eyes held something that might have been farewell. "Go on," Silas said. "You've got your own life to live, your own territory to protect." The mountain lion turned and walked into the darkness with fluid grace. Within moments, she'd disappeared completely, leaving no trace except the memory of what they'd shared. Silas sat alone in the cold, listening to the night sounds. An owl called from somewhere in the distance, the wind rustled through the pines. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Everything was as it had always been, and yet nothing was the same. He finally pushed himself to his feet with a groan and made his way back to the house. Inside, he collapsed onto the couch without even making it to his bedroom. Sleep claimed him instantly, pulling him down into dreams filled with amber eyes and mountain paths, and a daughter's voice saying she wanted to come home. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The clock showed 8:23 a.m. He'd slept for 10 hours straight, his body shutting down to repair the damage from yesterday's ordeal. Silas sat up slowly, cataloguing the injuries. His shoulders were stiff and sore, his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The scratches on his arms had scabbed over, and the bruises on his ribs had turned purple and green. But he was alive. Against all odds, he'd made it home. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bright morning. The fence line showed no sign of the mountain lion. She was gone, back to her wilderness, back to her life, as it should be. But something caught his eye near the gate. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he grabbed his coat and hurried outside, moving faster than his battered body wanted to allow. At the fence line, Right where the mountain lion had sat last night was a gift. A rabbit, freshly killed, still warm, laid carefully just outside the fence. It hadn't been torn apart or partially consumed. It was whole and unmarked, except for the killing bite to the neck. The mountain lion had left him food. Silas knelt slowly beside the offering, his throat tightening with emotion. In the wild, predators didn't share kills. They defended them fiercely, fought for every scrap. But here was a gift from a creature who'd already given him so much. A final gesture of something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Or perhaps friendship. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the rabbit, then out toward the wilderness where the mountain lion had disappeared. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of day that made Montana's reputation. The Bitterroot Range stood sharp against the blue sky, snow-capped peaks glowing in the early light. Somewhere out there, the mother mountain lion was returning to her territory, carrying the memory of her lost kit and the strange human who'd tried to save it. She'd go on, as wild things do, adapting and surviving. But Silas knew he'd changed something in her, just as she'd changed something in him. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a dust cloud rising from the long driveway that connected his ranch to the county road. His heart began to race. Emma. He walked quickly back to the house, suddenly aware of how he must look. The scratches and bruises couldn't be hidden, but he could at least comb his hair and put on a clean shirt. He moved through the house in a controlled rush, trying to make himself presentable. But as he passed the mirror in the hallway, he stopped. The man looking back at him was different from the one he'd seen yesterday morning. Older, yes, more worn, but something in the eyes had changed. They were clearer, more present, more alive. Yesterday, he'd made a choice. He'd chosen hope over practicality, chosen to fight, even when the odds said not to bother. That choice hadn't saved the bobcat, but it had saved something in himself. It had reminded him that trying mattered, that showing up mattered, that sometimes the journey itself was the point. He left his appearance as it was and walked out to the porch. The truck that pulled into the yard was a newer model SUV with Seattle plates. It parked near the house, and for a moment nothing happened. Just the tick of the cooling engine and the morning birds calling to each other. Then the driver's door opened, and Emma stepped out. Silas felt time telescope, present and past colliding. She was 30 years old now, a woman, but he could still see the girl in her features. She'd inherited Sarah's dark hair and his own grey eyes, the combination creating something uniquely beautiful. She wore jeans and a simple jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked terrified. They stood there, separated by 20 feet of yard, looking at each other. All the words Silas had rehearsed in his head disappeared. All the speeches he'd imagined giving evaporated. There was just his daughter, home after 3 years, and him with no idea what to say. Emma broke the silence. "You look terrible." "What happened?" Despite everything, Silas laughed. Leave it to Emma to cut through the awkwardness with blunt honesty. "Long story," he said. "I'll tell you over breakfast if you want." She took a tentative step forward, then another. "You always have the right. You're my daughter. This is your home. I haven't been much of a daughter lately. And I haven't been much of a father, so maybe we're even." Emma's eyes were filling with tears. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for leaving and staying gone. I'm sorry for not calling. I'm sorry for blaming you for things that weren't your fault." "I'm sorry too," Silas said, his own voice breaking. "Sorry for not understanding what you needed. Sorry for being too stubborn to reach out. Sorry for letting pride keep us apart." They moved toward each other then, meeting in the middle of the yard. The hug was tentative at first, awkward with 3 years of distance between them. But then Emma tightened her grip, and Silas felt her shoulders shaking with sobs, and he held her the way he'd held her when she was small and the world seemed too big and scary. "I missed you so much," Emma said into his shoulder. "Every day, even when I was angry, even when I convinced myself I was better off alone, I missed you." "I missed you too, sweetheart. Every single day." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other, letting the words neither of them had been brave enough to say flow out in broken sentences and shared tears. The morning sun warmed them. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and sage, and somewhere in the distance, if Silas listened carefully, he could almost hear a mountain lion's call, a sound that might have been approval. They eventually made their way inside, and Silas started coffee while Emma sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done homework as a child, where the family had shared countless meals. Her eyes roamed the space, taking in the details that hadn't changed in 3 years. "It's exactly the same," she said softly. "I thought it would feel different, but it's like I never left." "Some things should stay the same," Silas said, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. "Gives you something solid to come back to." He sat down across from her and launched into the story of yesterday's journey. He told her about tracking the calf, finding the bobcat in the trap, making the choice to try to save it. He described the long walk, the stalking mountain lion, the terrifying encounter with the wolves in Wolf's Gullet. Emma listened with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting with questions, her expression shifting from disbelief to wonder to grief as he described the bobcat's death. "That's incredible," she said when he finished. "And impossible. A mountain lion defending you, leaving you food. Dad, that's the kind of story people make up. I know how it sounds, but look," he held up his scratched arms, showed her the bruises. "Every word is true." Emma reached across the table and took his hand, examining the marks gently. "You could have died out there. What were you thinking, trying to save a wild animal like that?" "I was thinking about your mother," Silas said quietly, "about promises and second chances, about not giving up just because the odds aren't in your favor. Mum would have done the same thing. She never could walk past something that needed help. She was a better person than me." "No," Emma said firmly. "Just different. You're good in your own way, Dad. I forgot that for a while. Or maybe I was too angry to see it." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing more easily than Silas had dared hope. Emma told him about her life in Seattle, her job as a graphic designer, the apartment she shared with a friend. She talked about the relationships she'd tried and failed to maintain, how she kept pushing people away without understanding why. "I think I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of losing people the way we lost Mom. It seemed easier to not let anyone get too close." "I know that feeling," Silas said. "I've been doing the same thing for 10 years, keeping the world at arm's length because it's safer than risking getting hurt again. But you risked everything for that bobcat." "I did, and it died anyway. But I don't regret trying. That's what I learned yesterday. The trying matters, even when the outcome isn't what you hoped for." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "I want to stay for a while, if that's okay. Not just a visit, I mean actually stay. I've been thinking about it for months, even before I found Mom's letters. Seattle is fine, but it's not home. This is home." Silas felt his chest constrict with emotion. "You're always welcome here, for as long as you want. I don't know what I'll do for work. Internet up here is probably still terrible for freelancing. We'll figure it out, one day at a time." They spent the afternoon together, falling into old rhythms. Emma helped Silas tend to Rusty and check on the cattle. He showed her the trap he'd confiscated from the ravine, explaining his plan to report it to the current wildlife officers. They walked the fence line together, and when they reached the spot where the mountain lion had left the rabbit, Silas told Emma about the gift. "Can I see where she buried her kit?" Emma asked. Silas hesitated. It felt like intruding on something sacred, but Emma's expression was earnest, and he understood. She needed to see it to complete the story. They walked into the tree line, Silas following the mountain lion's tracks from memory. The grave was easy to find, a patch of disturbed earth beneath the ponderosa pine. The mother had covered it well, but not so completely that the spot was invisible. Emma knelt beside it, her hand resting on the earth. She loved it so much, enough to trust a stranger, to fight wolves, to bury it with her own hands. "Pause," Silas corrected gently. You know what I mean. She looked up at him. Do you think we could put something here? Some kind of marker? Together, they gathered stones from the surrounding area, building a small cairn over the grave. It wasn't much, but it felt right. A memorial to a life that had been brief but meaningful, to a journey that had changed everyone involved. As they worked, Silas felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. His daughter was home. They were healing what had been broken. And somehow, impossibly, a wild creature had shown him the way back to hope. When the cairn was complete, they stood in silence for a moment, then walked back to the house together, father and daughter, ready to begin rebuilding what they'd almost lost forever. 3 months later, Silas stood on his porch in the early morning light, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the Bitterroot Range in shades of gold and rose. The ritual was the same as it had been for decades, but everything else had changed. Behind him, he could hear Emma moving around in the kitchen, making breakfast. She'd converted the spare bedroom into a makeshift office and had managed to land several freelance contracts that let her work remotely. The internet was still terrible, but she made it work, driving into town once a week to upload files from the coffee shop. More importantly, she'd started smiling again. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes when she first arrived had gradually faded, replaced by something lighter. She'd even started talking about maybe taking over some of the ranch operations, learning the business side so Silas could eventually step back. The future didn't seem quite so lonely anymore. Rusty nickered from the corral, and Silas smiled. The horse had fully recovered from his wild flight through the foothills, though he remained skittish around certain sections of the ranch. Silas didn't blame him. Some memories stayed with you. The illegal traps had been dealt with. Silas had reported the serrated trap to the wildlife officers, who'd launched an investigation that resulted in 3 arrests. The poachers had been operating in the area for nearly 2 years, and Silas's evidence had been the break the authorities needed. The judge had imposed heavy fines and jail time, and the word had spread. The illegal trapping had stopped, at least for now. Every few days, Silas made the walk out to the grave beneath the ponderosa pine. The cairn still stood, weathering gradually as cairns do. Sometimes he found tracks nearby, large cat prints that could only belong to one animal. The mother came back sometimes, keeping vigil over her lost kit. Silas never saw her on these visits, but he felt her presence, a watchful awareness in the shadows. They'd developed an understanding, he and the mountain lion. She kept the deer population in check, and he made sure his livestock was secured at night. She stayed away from the ranch buildings, and he didn't venture too deep into her territory. It was a balance, the kind that humans and predators had maintained for thousands of years before fear and misunderstanding drove them apart. Emma appeared on the porch, carrying her own mug of coffee. She'd taken to joining him for these morning rituals, and they'd talk about the day ahead, the ranch work that needed doing, the small details of life that accumulate into something meaningful. "I've been thinking," Emma said, leaning against the porch rail, "about expanding, maybe running some ecotourism, teaching people about the wildlife and the land. There's money in that, and it would fit with what you know. People paying to walk around and look at mountains?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "People paying to learn from someone who knows this land better than anyone alive, who can teach them about respecting wildlife, about conservation, about living in harmony with predators instead of fear." Silas considered it. The idea of strangers tramping through his ranch didn't appeal, but then again, maybe sharing what he knew had value. Maybe the story of the bobcat and the mountain lion needed to be told, not as entertainment but as a lesson. "We'd have to set strict rules," he said. "No harassment of animals, no straying from designated paths, and we'd shut down during calving season." Emma grinned. "I'll draw up a proposal." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day brighten. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. In the distance, elk were moving down from the higher elevations, their antlers visible against the tree line. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked suddenly. Trying to save the bobcat? Knowing it died anyway? Silas thought about the question, really considered it. The journey had cost him physically, his shoulders still ached on cold mornings, and some of the scratches had left permanent scars. It had been dangerous and arguably foolish, and the outcome had been what any practical person would have predicted from the start. "No," he said finally. "Not for a second. That journey taught me something I'd forgotten. It taught me that hope isn't about guaranteed outcomes. It's about choosing to try, choosing to care, even when logic says not to bother. If I hadn't tried to save that bobcat, you and I might still be strangers. I'd still be locked up in my grief, pretending that isolation was strength." "The bobcat saved you," Emma said softly. "In a way, by reminding me what your mother always knew. That love means being willing to hurt. That connection is worth the risk. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is show up and try, even when success seems impossible." Emma reached over and took his hand. "I'm glad I came home." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As if in answer, a long, echoing call drifted across the morning air. Both of them turned toward the sound, toward the tree line where the wilderness began. For just a moment, a familiar tawny shape was visible on a distant ridge. The mountain lion stood silhouetted against the rising sun, watching the ranch, watching them. Then she turned and disappeared into the forest, a wild thing returning to her wild world. But the connection remained, invisible and enduring. A reminder that mercy and courage could bridge the gap between species, that compassion could transform enemies into allies, and that sometimes the smallest acts had the largest consequences. Silas raised his coffee mug in a silent salute to the departed cat, then turned back to his daughter, to his ranch, to the life he'd almost given up on. The sun continued its climb into a clear Montana sky. The day stretched ahead, full of work and possibility. And Silas Vance, who'd learned to hope again in the shadow of Wolf's Gullet, was ready to meet it.